Great, let's kick off. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our panel around hiring. If you don't know who I am, my name is Rowson. I'm a principal on the investment team at Salesforce Ventures based here in New York. And joining me today are Tony and Kate, who I'll let introduce themselves. Tony, why don't you kick off?
Thank you for having me today. I'm the CEO and founder of Oyster HR. We are a global employment platform. We help companies employ people anywhere in the world. I am calling you today from my home, the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean, and look forward to the conversation.
And Kate.
Hello, I'm Kate Hallick, based in San Francisco. I've been at Salesforce going on 10 years, so I'm a fossil, and have worn many different recruiting hats there. Started in our sales recruiting function, internal recruiting, internal mobility, sourcing, and then M&A and integrations. So lots of different experiences, and have also worked on the agency side, hiring for startups. So happy to be here today.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I suppose the first question I have, and this is maybe for you, Tony, what's the biggest challenge you often see faced by young companies around hiring?
We have to start with the core issue that many companies face today in terms of finding top talent in the knowledge work era, which is talent shortage. There are 85 million jobs going unfulfilled west, according to BCG, that's 8.5 trillion economical loss. So when you look at talent, you want to find them, it is really hard to find high quality talent that is cost effective in 20-mile radius when you have offices. So what we've seen some of our customers to go beyond their borders and tap into the global talent pool, because you have over 1 billion knowledge workers coming into the workforce in the next 10 years, mostly from emerging economies, which is the biggest demographic shift when it comes to worker demographics since the Industrial Revolution, and AI is just going to accelerate that. So number one is really the talent shortage. Number two, as you venture into building a distributed workforce, is you want to know, how do you employ these people? How do you be compliant with all the regulation in different countries? How do you pay fairly across multiple geographies? What kind of benefits do you want to offer in country A versus country B that is relevant to these teams? And thirdly, as you build this global workforce, well, how do you manage them? How do you operate a business that is in multiple countries effectively and at scale in a way that makes people engaged, makes people productive, and makes people happy to work with you? These are some of the challenges that we see our customers and ourselves. We ourselves are 500 people distributed in 70 countries, and we had to be intentional in designing our recruitment processes, our culture, so that it can deliver a high level of engagement across multiple countries.
And I think, Salesforce obviously is a huge scaled business now. When you think about how we've built that recruiting function and kind of how we built that from the ground up, what do you think have been, I suppose, the biggest successes and maybe the biggest learnings from the Salesforce standpoint?
When we acquire a company, one that comes to mind is we acquired a company in Darmstadt, and they were an engineering first company. And when we were going through the integration with them, it was, okay, you still have hires to make, but you have no employee brand there now with Salesforce. And so our biggest question was, how big is your referral network? Are you able to tap in to make these hires quickly? If not, what can we use on the Salesforce side in terms of employee brand, career site, advertising on LinkedIn to help you get the application flow needed in that region? I think for us, when even just thinking of scaling from small startups that are coming online, that employee brand is a big piece. And so the smaller the company, the more competitive the market in getting your name out there. And so really understanding that piece and how can you build your brand in the region or location that you're going to be hiring.
Yeah.
To add here to what Kate said in terms of employee brand, because it's critical. At Oyster, we are a 4-year-old company. We receive 13,000 job application a month. And how we were able to get there is by being intentional in designing our employee brand, which is answering the question, how does it feel to work with us? How can people be successful working here? What are the best practices of working here? We open source that, and it became a guide for people and other companies to use. And that serves us as a great way to drive great candidates to our job sites. And we receive more than 1,000 applications per role company.
Yeah, the sort of competitiveness in the market and how brand relates to that is interesting, because I mean, particularly as an early stage company, you're not always offering the highest salary or the best benefits. How do you think early stage companies can be competitive against larger companies?
You need to attract, you need to design the brand to make it appealing for people to want to work with you. So it is more than just a paycheck, as you just mentioned. You'll obviously pay people fairly across borders. The question is, how does it feel to work here? As I said, we open sourced our way of operating our Oyster operating system online, but other employees in the company, they are advocate of working with us. So they go on LinkedIn and they share their experiences working with us. We encourage people to do so. We also share upfront how much we pay people, right? So it's also this level of transparency is very welcomed by candidate, because there's a lot of anxiety in terms of how much you want to pay somebody. So we're very transparent about this. And I think there's a role for the founder to play, because at the end of the day, the founder is designing the culture. It is the founder's DNA. So the founder need to be out there, need to be on social media, talking about the company, evangelizing the way of working here. And last but not least is to talk about your mission, your company mission, because you want to attract people that have affinity with your company mission. And for us, it's been a tremendous journey to just talk about why we're here, reducing inequality, reversing brain drain by allowing people to access this global job opportunity in emerging economies. We have people from all over the world joining together to build this amazing company, because we give them more than just a paycheck. We give them fulfillment. We give them purpose, and that goes a long way to create a high level of commitment and engagement.
Yeah, culture is key. Kate, what do you see as, I suppose, the key elements of a strong culture? I think Salesforce has an amazing culture, and to have sustained that at scale is quite extraordinary. What do you think drives that, has enabled that?
Yeah. So from a culture perspective, I think of as everyone aligned to the North Star. What is the North Star? Is there a mission statement? Is it your vision statement? Something that we can align on as a collective at the top. That's kind of the what to me. Do you have the what defined, and is everyone speaking the same language globally on what the mission is? I think then how the culture then is experienced is at that local level. And so how do you really ensure if a value or part of your mission statement is innovation, what are you doing on the ground to create an environment of innovation? And so to me, it's that, big vision, tying it to what you're doing every day, showing that your impact is directly correlated to it. And I think of culture as not only top down, but also bottoms up. If everyone in your company feels, or your team feels that connection to the vision or where we're going, it's going to multiply and make sure that it's real and it's not just a tagline on your website.
Particularly when you think about expanding offices, expanding across geos, how do you approach sustaining the core culture of the company whilst also, I suppose, opening up to geo-specific influences, for example?
I think about how important that first leader is in that hub. So if you're opening up a new hub or a new region, who's going to be the person on the ground that really is that office leader when you're not there as the CEO or the head of? That person really has that remit in their role and their scope, that's bringing people together in and outside of the office, regardless of job function. And then two is, where's the checks and balances to ensuring that the what is being experienced in somewhat of the same flavor, even if there's local flavor, it's still being instilled. So Salesforce, we're constantly in this giving back, right? So one of the things we do is we do VTO, and that's a way that we tie, what we do outside of the office to our values. So my question for a startup would be like, what is your mechanism for tying your values to things you do in or outside the office?
You mentioned sort of first hires or senior hires in new geos. Tony, I'm interested how you approach that in terms of identifying the right first hire in a new geo. Kind of what are the key characteristics you're looking for, and perhaps what are the characteristics you're not looking for?
Can I answer that? I'd like to also, before answering that question, I want to add to what Kate said about how do you sustain the culture across multiple geographies. I think first you have to let go your national identity. You're not a French company anymore. You're not a British company or an American company. You are a company. And you do that in a way to create a homogeneous way of working, no matter where people are, no matter which country they are. This is how we work. And you make it inclusive, which means that not because you're not in the headquarters that you don't have access to career opportunities, or you cannot be as productive as being in the headquarters. These are really important to create a global culture that will create high level of engagement and productivity. Now, what is the profile or the characteristic of the right first hire in a geo? For me, I look at experience of not only scaling from 0 to 1 to start up the market, but also to be able to lead a bit beyond that from 1 to 10. So ability to scale, because you don't want to hire somebody and after 1 year you realize actually you already need a more scalable leader in that role. So you need to look at a bit further, maybe 3-4 years down the line, to hire leaders that are capable to jumpstart the business in that geo, but also lead it to a certain level of scale. Secondly, it's about, in general, that's kind of specific to a new geo, but in general, I would look at mission alignment. So we need to believe the same thing about the world. I looked at level of what I call fit for purpose. So their previous experiences have to be fit for what they're trying to do here. So example, our general counsel, she was integrating compliance software into software. So she's very relevant experience. So every one of my leaders has a reason why they are here. And lastly, I look at diversity, right? So I look at making sure that I bring people in my team that create a level of diversity, whether it's gender diversity or any other dimension of diversity. Even if it means taking 3 months longer to hire somebody, I would ensure that we hit a certain diversity ratios.
That speed to hire thing can present challenges, though. How do you balance making the right hire long term with the need to get someone in a seat relatively quickly?
Speed to hire, I think of sales hiring specifically, and it's like everyone wanted them onboarded and ramped yesterday. And so my first question is always, what's your operating plan? What's your agreement with finance on, against your key priority hires? When can you actually afford them? And creating a capacity plan from there. But for me, speed is efficiencies. And so when I think of how to make a quick hire, it takes the preparation of knowing what you actually want. So it might be easy to say, I want a salesperson, but is it an enterprise salesperson? Is it a small business salesperson? Is it a player coach? From there, what skills are needed? And the more prep you can do with your hiring partner or with your teams to put pen to paper on the skills, attributes, competencies that make that good hire, it's going to make the hiring process go so much quicker. And I feel like some of the pitfalls that I got to definitely in the past in agency was, you think you know what you want as a hiring manager, and then it's, after 20 candidates later, you actually don't know what you want, or you're looking for that purple squirrel still that doesn't exist. And so even just knowing like, what are your must-haves versus like to haves, minimum qualifications, that's interviewing to those will create speed and accountability back with that hiring partner to say, this person ticks 7, 8 out of the 10 boxes. This now is the trade-off between having an empty seat and the cost of having an empty seat versus someone that meets 80% of what you're looking for and can do the job.
Yeah. Tony, how do you think about that trade-off?
Like for me, there's obviously business objectives that you need to hit. So you have to align your recruitment capacity to achieve that. Like for instance, right now we're hiring a lot of salespeople, as Kate said, and we need them yesterday. So we kind of repurposed our hiring capacity to go there, and we accepted that we will delay other hires. So it's a question of really having the right priorities and making sure that the other teams are not burning out. So you have to also manage that, right? So you have multiple variables to manage. And at the moment in the current environment, we are very prudent in how fast we hire. So really focusing on hiring the top priorities and pushing other priorities down the line.
So a more difficult question is then how quickly do you decide if someone is not a fit?
My off-the-cuff answer is, how long did you expect them to ramp? What expectations were set in the beginning? Was there a 30, 60, 90-day plan that you can already look at and say, did you achieve what we set out to achieve in that first 3 months, 6 months, 90 days, whatever it is? And if not, then are we at a point of giving feedback and working on a different solution?
Tony?
Well, you need to have a clear performance management in your business to be able to make these quick decisions that are beneficial for both parties as quickly as possible. So it's not easy to do across a company. In sales roles, it's easier because it's much more data driven. But you need to develop and implement. Your people team will know how to implement performance management process across the business and continue to raise the level of performance over time.
I'm curious, do you notice differences in how you approach hiring in the US versus other geos? Tony, I'll go to you first.
Yes. So thank you for the question. So what's different between the US and other markets? One is it's an at-will employment. So essentially people can start quickly compared to, let's say, France. You have to wait 3 months probation period to really hire somebody. So it is much faster. People move from role to another role much quicker. So that's an advantage, but they also can leave much quickly, right? So you have to take that into consideration. The other aspect is candidates in the US are much more financially driven than in other countries. So the package, the compensation package, the benefit is so critical. Healthcare in the US, you need to offer private health insurance for them to be able to join your company. It's unlike other countries where they have more national social insurance that is good enough. In the US, you cannot do that. So the compensation and the benefits are of utmost importance for hires in the US than in other countries. And they do expect equity, obviously, so like in other countries, but they have they assign a higher coefficient to the total compensation package than in other countries. Yeah, this would be like from a high level what I see hiring in the last 20 years in the US and elsewhere.
Kate, does that resonate? Yeah.
Nothing more to add. That was perfect. Yeah.
Going back to managing teams across multiple geographies, what do you see as the key challenges and maybe the key opportunities for international teams?
So I'll take my own personal experience. I have about 120 people across all of our regions on the globe. So we have multiple different time zones that make it really inefficient when we're trying to collaborate or bring people together live on a Zoom call. So one of the key challenges is just communication. What's said versus what the meeting notes say or the tone isn't always grasped if you're watching it back later. And so we have really gotten better about async project work, creating deadlines to then be able to have the collaboration happen offline or in groups, then bringing it back to a group async has been helpful. And creating some formal structures on things that need to be built. So we're in a place right now where we're doing a transformation within our own recruiting org with processes and systems. And so our goal is not that the U.S. is building it one way, and then EMEA is adopting it. It's being co-created with a lead in EMEA and a lead in the U.S., and then it's being signed off by India and it's being signed off by Japan. And so the idea that, you know, nothing moves forward until all parties kind of confirm that this is going to work locally. We've established that sort of cadence, working async, and then you know, doing what we can to meet offline and create those like coffee meeting connections for onboarding or mentorship or sponsorship purposes. I think that really comes from making sure the leaders are connected across the regions.
And Tony, Oyster is a fully remote organization. What are the key things you've implemented that you feel support that? And I suppose the second part of the question, how important is it to have in-person opportunities as well?
Yeah, great question. So let me start with the second piece that is quicker. I think it's absolutely important to meet from time to time, not necessarily to get stuff done, but to create deeper human connections. So in my team, we meet at least twice a year. I'm talking about my C-level team, where usually it's a retreat around a specific strategic topic, supported by a lot of activities that get people to connect at a deeper level. And why this is important, because managing the team across geographies require building trust intentionally. Because unlike when we used to come to the office all the time, we used to essentially confuse presence with productivity. Here, we don't see the person in seat anymore. So we have to default to building trust behavior across the business. And how I do this in the company here, I thrive to create high level of psychological safety. I don't react to negative news badly. I assume best intent. Secondly is about, as Kate was mentioning, is to default to async working operation. We call it the Oyster operating model. These are a definition of how we work together. What tools do you use for what situations? How do you prepare for a meeting? What documentation you send ahead of the meeting? The meeting attendees, they have to engage with that content at least 24 hours before, so that meetings are extremely productive and can be done. I mean, if it's unnecessary to do a meeting, better not to do a meeting. Many things can get done asynchronously if the format is well designed and the people are trained to use that format. And the third area that you need to build intentionally is to be clear about what success looks like on an individual level, team level, and company level, and connect the three together. We use a method that many of you, I'm sure, use here called Objective Key Result, or OKRs. We take it much more advanced compared to our stage because people need to know if they wake up in Manila in the morning, and they need to know what we expect from them and what success looks like, even if their manager is on the other side of the world.
I'm going to ask one more question and then open up for broader questions. What has been your biggest mistake learning around hiring international teams?
I don't know if it's a mistake, but I think it goes back to the speed versus quality, maybe. When we're hiring in India and we're hiring in Japan, laws there are very different. And so not spending enough time upfront understanding the legalities of a key hire, we had to work backwards from it after, kind of untangle it. So I think the importance of just knowing kind of what Tony say, like the U.S. is at will, but what other countries do you need to know the ins and outs of before you make a key hire? So that would be my one. But maybe if it's not just international, other hiring mistakes, it's just the preparation work. Back to, like, you can't really rely on the resume only. And I think when you see a big name brand on a resume, you're like, oh, they can do it, or this is a really well-renowned company, or I admire this company. I would love to have them as part of my team. But what you really need at your size of company might not be Google or Facebook. And so thinking through more about are you really interviewing towards skills and competencies, not just your resume? And I think that's when you can really find the right people. But I've seen many times where the crutch is the resume and not truly the skills that you need for that role at that time, at that size of company.
Okay, thank you. Tony?
I'd like to add that one of the mistakes I made was to hire people that were not flexible enough to adapt their way of working to the Oyster way of working. Obviously, there's a shift happening right now in how we work. We're moving from in-office to more distributed way of working. And there are leaders that are more flexible from, I call it ego flexibility. Can they unlearn what they learned and adjust to a new way of working? How quickly they can adopt the new way of working? I think that's critical as we shift the way we work in the next 10 years, is to look at people who are much more open and flexible and agile to shift their way of working to the new world of work.
Thank you. We will take a break for 5-10 minutes and then move on to our next panel. But Kate, Tony, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you, everyone.
So we're going to kick off our second panel. It's a pleasure to introduce Amanda and Rachel. I'll let you introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Amanda Buck. I'm with BigID. I've been there for a little over 3 years, and I lead talent acquisition globally. So when I first started, I think we were in 12 countries, and now we're in 26. So it's been a journey, but it's been awesome.
Hi, I'm Rachel Cochran. I lead our people function at Algolia. Algolia originally was founded in France and has since migrated over to the U.S. and now we operate in 17 countries. And Algolia offers AI-powered search infrastructure.
Well, it's great to have you. I think we'll take this opportunity to maybe go a little bit more tactical and talk about sort of compensation and benefits and actually managing employees, particularly across different geos. So my first question is really around what are the particular challenges faced by early stage companies when thinking about compensation and equity for early employees, and particularly how to do that scalably as you expand?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is you're trying to grow quickly, but knowing that whatever decisions you make early on are going to impact as you continue to grow. So I think kind of taking the time to think about what you want your compensation philosophy to be, how you want to distribute equity, and not just kind of thinking situation by situation and kind of feeling like you have to, accommodate every single candidate, but really trying to kind of think about what you're comfortable with and how that's going to continue to grow, because it does lead to, cultural challenges down the road, because anything that you change around compensation it's just deeply personal to people. And so that's something that you have to keep in mind. Those are not easy changes to make, and there's a lot of change management and time and thought. So you obviously aren't expected to have a 35-page guide of your compensation philosophy and how you handle every situation, but I think anchoring around a couple of core principles, like where do you want to position in the market, what data sources are you using, thinking about things like basic leveling guides, so you have some of the basics there that you can grow and kind of build to be more detailed over time.
Yeah, I use the word compensation philosophy as well. I just love it. I think it's hugely important. I agree with everything you said, Rachel. I think for us it's been different, right, from a shifting perspective. When I started, we were at about 250, and then now growing to about 500. So we've definitely seen the scale, and we are doing a little bit of change, and we're getting a little bit of remorse, right? So I think being really thoughtful up front and understanding what you as a team want to portray to your employees, and it goes really to the nitty gritty, even like the benefits you're going to offer, right, for different employees in different regions. Are you going to offer their family benefits as well? Are you only going to offer the employee benefits? And really thinking strategically about, as you grow as a company, what you want the teams to grow and look like as well.
On that idea of sort of compensation philosophy, how did your BigID approach defining that and kind of setting that? Was that top-down decision, or did that evolve over time?
It's definitely evolved over time, but I think at the beginning it was definitely a top-down decision. I think it's the values, right? It comes back to the core values and the mission of who we are. Our values are care, do, try, and shine. And so making sure that we're setting everyone up for success and kind of living out the values as well, which has been really fruitful kind of leading up to where we are today and being able to grow and getting the reviews and getting the employees involved, right? We want everyone, it's a team sport, so we want everyone involved in kind of where we're at. But yeah, definitely top down first.
What about Algolia?
Yeah, I would say at Algolia, it's evolved a lot. So the early days, there was a culture of complete transparency. Like, for example, there was a spreadsheet with every single person's compensation on it, right? Like, we don't do that today anymore. And so as we've grown, we've had to kind of think a little bit more about the maturity of some of our practices. And so now where we're at is really focusing on manager education. So now that we, when I came in, really tried to kind of articulate, because it was actually written down, like, what was our compensation philosophy? Where do we pay to the market? How do we handle different situations? So we spent a lot of time documenting that. So now we're at a point where we can spend time with our executive team, our senior leadership team, and our people managers, really educating them so that it's not just something that happens in the background with the people team, but that they feel really confident speaking about compensation. So it's definitely been a journey, but I think education is kind of like the biggest piece of that as you continue to grow.
Yeah. And how do you approach that, educating the team?
Yeah, so I mean, we're in the middle of our comp cycle, so after this I get to go sit in on calibration meetings and help our team through that. But the way that we've approached leadership is kind of what I said before, like starting with our most senior leaders, right? Because we have to make sure that every layer of leadership is able to support the next layer. So it's a combination of, I would say, like formal trainings, people business partner coaching, if that's a structure that you have, or just kind of coaching from the people team in smaller groups and in one-on-ones to make sure that everybody's kind of conveying the same message. And then from there we kind of continue to like cascade that. So I think like cascading communications and making sure that you can differentiate the content based on the audience, but you got to have like the core of the same content across the board that to make sure everybody's going to be giving the same message.
Yeah, and across geos as well, right? Being in so many countries, making sure that everyone at the top level is on the same page to be able to have those conversations and bring in the HRBPs to formulate them, but also everyone should be on the same wavelength at the top. Yeah, which is really important. I think different geos is
Sure. I'm interested, how do you see compensation and benefits expectations differ across geos, and how has that impacted how you've expanded?
Yeah. We've had a compensation manager now for about 2 years. She's awesome, and she's been able to, we've expanded pretty quickly into probably like the last 10 geos that we went into, and really understanding the market and getting that compensation data is a bit difficult, and it's a bit pricey as well. So really understanding, from a TA perspective, we've tried to just talk to candidates and really understand what are we seeing in the market, what are candidates asking for when we're speaking to them, and then reverting back to the data that she's been able to find or get and kind of translate, okay, this is what we think and this is what would be best. Using an employer of record as well. I know Oyster, they're hugely beneficial in regards to hiring just globally. We've used a couple different ones, and I think they have a lot of information, and so to use them and utilize them and what they can offer, and then to educate yourself as well is really important, because there's, like we have said, multiple rules and regulations across different geographies, but it's been really helpful to kind of get there, kind of this is what the standard is versus this is what the high-tech startups are offering, this is what maybe in healthcare they offer, understanding kind of what verticals and who offers what in order to set yourself up for success in those different geos.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Amanda said. I think like leaning on the experts that you can work with, whether it's an employee of record, benefit brokers, if you're managing your own entities. We do a combination of that. So we have 5 entities that we manage, and we partner with experts in different areas, and then also an employee of record or employer of record. The other thing I would say is also just, listening to employees. So you get a lot of really great data points from conversations you have while you're trying to bring on new talent, but also just, kind of having a pulse on what, matters to your team members, and kind of thinking about, like, as you go through benefits renewals and things like that, like, you got to have that feedback to help understand what's working and what's not working.
Yeah.
I've also actually reached out to leaders at other companies in that geo, right? So I reached out to Zscaler folks who don't have a role, and I let them know, hey, I don't have a role, but I'd love to chat with you about hiring in region. What have you seen success in? What haven't you seen success in? And it's been really helpful, and I've built relationships with leaders at different companies, and like the UAE, which we only have a couple hires in, but getting knowledge from them as well. And how many people are you hiring right now? And what does the market look like for you? And how are you staying competitive? And how are you engaging talent? And things like that. And so it was really helpful, specifically in those countries where we've only had one or two hires.
Are there some geos where it has been harder as a relatively early stage company to hire than others? Or how does that vary?
For sure. I think the flexibility that we as BigID want to have, and then also with the region that we're trying to hire in, because there are a bunch of countries that offer a lot of different benefits that we weren't familiar with.
Yeah.
And so trying to understand, okay, we have to pay for flights for them to go back to their country once a year, and we have to, so there's a lot of things that come into play that I'm like, wow, these are great benefits, but what kind of is standard for us to offer, and then what kind of is elevating the employees and will make them happy, right? We want them to be here for a long time. We don't just want them to be here for a year or two, so kind of what will extend their stay per se, to make them happy as a long-term employee and be invested in kind of what we're doing.
I think for us, the hardest region to hire for right now has been in Germany. Some of that has to do with just demand, especially in some of our go-to-market teams. But also, I think another consideration is when you're entering in new markets, partnering with an employee of record, can raise questions. So you have to make sure that like your leaders, your TA team, everybody is on the same page on like how you're positioning that, and making sure that you're consistent on like what your promises for growth are, because we have had a couple of candidates where that's, been part of their decision making, and they've been hesitant, I think, just based on, perceptions of risk or, what that would mean to move forward in the process.
We heard in the panel earlier that US employees tend to be more compensation focused, and certainly I think the salary expectations tend to be higher here. How does hiring US employees then impact employees in other geos, for example, if there's a discrepancy in terms of base salary?
It's interesting.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to some of my comments about education. I think there's a big difference if your leaders are equipped and understanding the different markets that they might be managing in and why the compensation packages look different, because there's a big difference in certain countries where you're provided with a lot more benefits and securities than in the US, right? Even just the concept of being employed at will, right? We have managers that are managing employees outside the US, and they're like, what do you mean I just can terminate somebody and that's their last day and they don't get, whatever X notice period, right? So it is very different. So I think your leaders being equipped, if they're going to be managing across geographic lines, to understand, what that means is really important, and kind of the same thing when it comes to compensation. Because, we do in the US, for example, we have geo differentials depending on kind of what type of market that you're living. That's something that we've introduced now in the UK and in France. And, there's lots of questions around why that is, or why an employee in a certain region makes more. So I think having that compensation philosophy, dedicating the time to education, and making sure your leaders are equipped in what it means to manage across the different geographies is really important. And it takes time, because I know you're kind of like trying to keep your head above water and just stay compliant in a lot of the things that you're doing. And so that's something that you kind of build up to. And even Algolia at 750 people, that's something my team is spending a lot of time on today doing at all levels of leadership, not just kind of at your frontline managers.
I think building internal processes too around it, right? So we have X amount of employees in India, we have X amount of employees in Portugal, and really kind of building up a process for that country, right? When we hire, how are we hiring there? What does the banding look like? How often are we updating that banding? And kind of making sure that as a team we're all on the same page. It's been a struggle for the 26 countries and kind of keeping everything in line for what we do for the first hire versus the third hire, or the first hire versus the sixth hire. But having the leaders in place per region, and some of them being like the owners or the GMs of that country, is really important and has been really helpful.
And once you feel confident, it's all going to change. It's like every month, spending time to kind of understand what's going on in the local geographies that you're operating. I mean, it's never going to be perfect. It's always going to evolve and change. And being comfortable with some of that, I think, is important as you're kind of going through these growth stages.
What are your tips for managing across many geos? You mentioned the importance of having kind of local leaders who really understand their market and take some responsibility. But sort of from a sort of centralized hiring perspective, how do you think about managing the whole group?
So we have like regional Slack channels. Kate. So regional Slack channels where we kind of allow everyone to communicate via those Slack channels, which has been really helpful, and get together if they're in kind of local or regions. We have a hub in Portugal, I'll use as an example. And it's interesting. You'll see some people will actually take the reins and they'll be like, "Hey team, we have money to spend for a dinner this month. Who wants to get together?" And some people will kind of appoint themselves, but then utilizing, I think, the EOR. So we actually have an entity in Portugal, but we still utilize an EOR there as well to understand exactly what we should be doing. There's a lot of different technicalities in Portugal, but I would say really understanding kind of what each function in each region needs, and then somebody will come rise to the ranks and kind of have more of a interest in kind of being the leader, unofficial leader, I would say.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the kind of like concept of like those early hires really matter, and somebody that is willing, to both do their function and their role there. So for example, we acquired a company in Australia, and the CEO of that company, who's now still with us, he's always in contact with my team about just like some of the basics of operating in Australia, things we should be thinking about. And so you kind of always have to wear multiple hats. And I would say from a cultural standpoint, I agree on you've got to identify who those leaders are. So we started a program called Community Leaders, where, we basically give leaders that step up across all of the areas where we have a hub, and we call a hub anywhere more than 10 Algolians that are in a location where they can kind of reasonably get together. We give them resources and say, hey, like, help drive culture in your region. You can plan events and, just give them a little bit of structure. And it's really cool to see how different everything that they do is, and, the boost in morale. From an operational standpoint, on my team, we've kind of designated there's clear kind of subject matter experts for every country. And so even if they're not truly a subject matter expert, they're responsible for kind of monitoring and understanding what's going on in that region, whether that's directly or partnering with legal counsel. And then we kind of systematize that, so at least, depending on how quickly our regions might be moving or changes might be happening, they update documentation and kind of, need to be aware of what's going on a quarterly or biannual or annual basis, just to make sure we kind of have that operational hygiene. But that's a big shift that we've made over the past year and a half.
Yeah. I like that idea of sort of culture carriers. As you expand teams across geos, how do you think about sort of systematically creating and sustaining culture? And I suppose sustaining some of what's core to like BigID or Algolia, as well as giving these teams some autonomy.
I think culture is always evolving, and if I've learned anything in my experience at Algolia, which is the first company that I've worked at that was not founded in the U.S., is you've got to kind of be able to feel comfortable with different geographies having their own culture. So I think that is like a mindset shift, and I think Tony said it right, like you're not an American company or you're not a French company, you're Algolia or whatever company. I think that's important, but relying on kind of like the local leaders to help drive that, thinking about like the needs of different programs and like how do you bring your values to life. That's something that we've spent some time on this year. because there have been like failed examples of launching things like values awards, right? Like you've got to get input and kind of make sure that you're not making unilateral decisions, especially if you have a concentration of leadership in any one area. So I think some of it's just about the culture of like, how do you make sure that you're getting enough input across the team? And you have to be comfortable with it might slow down your decision-making process, right? Like async work is not always faster, but I think it gives you a big opportunity to be inclusive. So those are just some of the things to think about.
I think, and what we've learned is there's a lot of companies or a lot of countries recognize like gratitude, I don't know what word I should use, but they recognize it differently, right? So like I said, we are in 26 countries, and somebody in the US may recognize, great job, thank you so much for all your hard work and what you've done, and then somebody in India, that's not how they want to be recognized, or they might not want to be rewarded that way, right? So understanding kind of the cultural differences across geographies and what will make the employees feel valued, and kind of what will work for them versus in different geos. We've seen a lot of it as well. So I think it's interesting. As you grow and as you scale, it's fun. It's a lot of learning. I think I like learn every single day something new, which I love. But I think from a leadership perspective, just making sure everyone is on the same page and communication and the transparency is really important.
I also think having leaders like experience working outside of like their home office or home country. Like I just went to Australia a couple of weeks ago to spend some time with our team down there for a company kickoff. It's like it really like gives you a new level of empathy when you're working on their hours and their time zone. And you know, for me, and I was just talking to Amy about this, like there's barely an hour of overlap between Sydney and Paris, right? And I was like, wow, like this team does this every day. So it kind of like gives you that empathy and fires you up to, you know, continue to improve working practices and, you know, just, I don't know, just have a little bit more empathy for the teams that are experiencing different things across the globe.
What systems or policies do you have in place to support multi-geo teams? Because it's a time zone issue, it's also can be a work culture issue. You know, how do you educate the company more broadly on how to interact with colleagues who are in a different place, come from a very different style of corporate background?
Yeah, I mean, we use Slack heavily, email. I think updating your calendar, right, your working hours. We've had a lot of folks doing that, making sure people have their time off in their calendars or their vacation time off in their calendars. We're a global team, but we're only, from a TA perspective, we're only in the U.S. and Tel Aviv as of right now. Yeah. So I'm available when folks need me. So it's interesting, but I think understanding, right, on our Slack we have like their geo, where they are, where they're located. We have our HRIS system where you can kind of see where everyone is located. But it's interesting, but it's awesome. Like I think I've never worked for such a large global, it's not even large because we're only 500 people, but for such a diverse kind of global workforce where there are people in so many geos. So it's been a fun challenge to tackle, but I think knowing where people are and we kind of have like the US, LATAM, EMEA, APJ, those are the 4 regions we're in, and then kind of consolidating that as well.
Yeah, I would say for us, it's an area that like we recognize we need to spend a lot more time on. So like most companies, pre-pandemic, very office focused. Post-pandemic, we've adopted what we're kind of calling a flexible workplace model. So we do have some locations based on kind of demand and foot traffic, or we'll have offices. So like in New York, we have an office down on Broadway, which is very heavy populated. We had other offices in places like Austin where there just wasn't a lot of interest in going in. And so as a result, we kind of follow the lead of the employees. What we didn't do was kind of have a strong point of view of like, what does this mean from the perspective of how we work together? What are kind of like the minimum viable set of norms that like in order to work effectively that we all have to adopt, because it gets really messy. Like there's this kind of like bring your own app to work like so everybody wants to use the tool that like best fits their team's needs or their individual needs, and that gets really hard when you're, you know, at scale to be able to manage if you don't have that clarity. And so that's a lot of the work that my team is doing right now, and we're doing it we do a lot by like task force or try and do these like grassroots, efforts to get the global perspective of the team. So we're trying to boil this down to a clearer set of working norms. But I think that's a good place to start. And Tony mentioned this too, of like, what is the Oyster way of working or the Algolia way of working? And having some like courage in your conviction, if that's what you agree to, then that's something that you need to infuse and kind of hold your team members accountable towards and model from your executive team all the way down if you want people to really adopt it, because it does make a big difference and it reduces a lot of that like just internal friction of like, do I send this via an email or via Slack or whatever number of tools that you might have, Salesforce chatter, like there's so many ways to communicate, and if you're not clear, I think a lot just gets, turns into noise.
Yeah.
I set like a clear like terms of communication with me specifically for my team. Like if you need an answer pretty quickly, it's give me a call or Slack me. If you need something that can kind of wait or I can get to, email me. But kind of setting those with my team has been really helpful. Or sometimes I'll get a text, be like, hey, can you talk? And I'm like, yeah, for sure, give me a call. But setting those with my team specifically, and then obviously I say my team, but my team is all of BigID from a talent perspective. So it's interesting. But yeah, we use WhatsApp a lot as well from a team perspective as well.
You mentioned this is the first non-U.S. founded company you've worked in. Is that right?
I did.
Oh, you did.
Yeah,
You
I was
did.
going to say
What was your biggest surprise coming into an organization founded outside of the US?
I mean, I think the biggest learning was how much of kind of like the history and ways of working, in particular for us in France, that I needed to be aware of, right? Because it wasn't just kind of like a small hub of people, other companies I worked for, like Evernote, for example, we had plenty of international offices, but they were a much smaller presence. And so their kind of like share of voice was just different. And there was a lot more, I think, of just accommodating to, okay, headquarters or the San Francisco office said do this, everybody just kind of falls in line. And I think being a company like where we have, it's 40% roughly between EMEA and the US, there's a much greater like share of voice. And I think that's really amazing, because I've learned so much about what it means to operate in Europe and in France and all of these intricacies, and also just appreciate some of the differences. So early on, I always try and take the time, like if we're trying to respond to something that's going on in the company, like I've got my little like board of advisors of different people that I know that will tell me the truth and help advise on like what's the best way to respond. Like for example, there were some protests in Paris around, I think, a police brutality issue, and I reached out to my team and I said, should we respond to this? Because if this was in the US, like we might be responding to this because it's an area where we've got a concentration of team members. And they were like, no, like we don't recommend you respond. Here's why it's culturally, sensitive. And that to me is like really powerful, because, that helps me kind of operate in a way that's reflective of the communities that we work in, and not kind of just operating as a US company and doing what I think, instinctually might be right or what I might do here.
Yeah, interesting. Amanda, how do you think about managing cultural sensitivities across the organization?
So we've built out in the last year and a half like a culture corner, a BigID culture corner, and we have different advocates from different regions and different geos who kind of contribute to it, which I'm learning so much just from different holidays that are happening, or different time off, or different events that are happening in every country. So it's been awesome to see the team kind of come together and kind of share. We have our HRIS system, we can kind of share different meeting notes from there, and then it goes out to the entire company globally.
Yeah.
But it's been a great way for the teams to come together and kind of see what's going on per region, per country. That's kind of where I'll leave it, but it's still a work in progress. Like I said, as you continue to grow, you have to learn, you have to understand, you have to build relationships, you have to build that rapport, kind of meeting with people in person and asking, right? You don't know unless you ask.
Yeah. Before we open for questions, maybe one more from me. As you've seen Algolia scale, what are some of the things maybe you wish you'd known or had put in place earlier?
Yeah, there's so many, and admittedly, when I joined, I was like, oh, this is a big company. There's going to be so much structure. Like, I came from a smaller company that was maybe like 200 people before I joined Algolia, and a lot of the structures were just not in place. So it's been really fun because I'm a builder and that's what I love to do. But I think some of the core pieces I would recommend defining kind of what your expectations are around what it means to be a great manager, because that then helps infuse and like influence what you do from a talent development standpoint and leadership development standpoint, because our managers manager training and enablement is just so important, especially as you're scaling, because they're your communicators and they're the ones who have most of the touch points with employees. The second one would be comp philosophy, just because compensation can be a real distractor if the team does not understand and don't know how to effectively communicate that and translate it to your team members. And then, the last one I would say is, again, connected back to like working norms. I think just having a clearer philosophy, like we had the values and a lot of like those basics, but I think just spending more time on how we work, as we continue to scale. And, when you go through those inflection points of 150 to 300 or 300 to 600, it's like just very different, and having a foundation that you can build on helps keep everybody on the same page, even if it changes, which it will inevitably.
There's a couple different ones, but I think thoughtfully hiring, I think we've seen over the last like 3 to 4 years a lot of companies ramping, and then we see a lot of layoffs happening, unfortunately. And I think we've really strategically hired across the board where we know that we need the talent. So I think that's something that I'm really proud of. The finding good partners at the beginning, so an employer of record, for example, that's a huge portion of our business, and kind of hiring and building trust and rapport with them. And when I first came on, we were using a partner who just, they were smaller, they were a startup, we wanted to give them the opportunity, but they just unfortunately weren't meeting the needs and weren't able to scale with us. So we kind of had to revert all of the employees off of that one platform and take them to a new platform. So building relationships with those types of partners if you are planning to scale in more than 3 to 5 to 7 countries, and then also potentially maybe opening entities in those is really important. And yeah, I would take the communication at the top as well is hugely important. We have a lot of different leaders spanning across all different countries, and so always keeping lines of communication open, and just, I think we're work hard, play hard, very much like the BigID mentality, but I think our values, kind of the care, do, try, shine is really important in caring for our employees and what we're building.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was super interesting. Really appreciate you coming.
Thanks.